Hello, my name is Michael Byers, and I am the chair of the Salt Spring Forum, a community-based charity on Salt Spring Island that brings interesting and influential people to this special place for discussions involving live in-person audiences. Last weekend, we hosted Suzanne Simard, a UBC forestry professor and the author of the recent book, Finding the Mother Tree. We decided to tape that event to share it with all of you. And we invited Tara Martin, a Salt Spring Island resident and also a forestry professor at UBC, to moderate the evening. So please enjoy, and please come and visit our little island sometime soon and come to an in-person event of the Salt Spring Forum. Good night.
Wow, wonderful to see you all.
Yay, Tara!
I agree, it's nice to see everybody. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, this has been, we've been sitting at home far too long, and it's just so lovely to be in a room of people. And to be here with my dear colleague Suzanne is such an honor. We work in the same department, and I'm fairly new in the department. I've only been there a couple of years, and one of those years has been in COVID. But I have to say that Suzanne is one of my heroes, and to be in the same place as her.
I thought it was the other way around.
So I feel giddy getting to share the stage with this incredible woman. And I guess let's just kick this off. I'd love to hear a bit about, your life growing up, and the moments kind of in which you knew that you wanted to understand more about the forest and what made those forests work.
Yeah, well, I was so fortunate because I grew up in the interior rainforests in the Monashee Mountains, which is kind of, where Maple Lake is between Vernon and the Arrow Lakes. And if anybody of you have been there, these are incredible forests. They're full of cedars and hemlocks and western white pines, larches, Douglas fir. They're incredibly diverse forests and very rich. The rivers are full of salmon. Or at least they used to be. and so I just grew up amongst these trees. And my family were horse loggers. My grandfather was especially a very innovative, inventive man. He built everything by hand. He was an inventor. They came from Quebec, so they emigrated westward, settled in that area. Thinking they were going to California, but ended up in British Columbia. Opened up the train car in the late 1800s and jumped out of the train car, and it was snow up to their eyeballs instead of sun. But they stayed and settled in that area and became horse loggers in these beautiful lush forests. And so as a child, I was amongst all that. And watching my grandfather make his own boats, make his own tools, make his own flumes and water wheels, and his tools. I remember in his, in the basement of my grandparents' house, which was right on the Shuswap River, which was an incredible river, his tools that most of them he'd forged by hand. And then he used these tools to build docks and boats and houseboats and loggers' houseboats and flumes and water wheels, as I said. So it was really, it was magical. I didn't know it at the time, I was just a kid, but now I look back and that was so formative for me. So I guess it was just where I grew up, and I don't think I really realized that I was a person of the forest until maybe I left that place, which I eventually did to go to school. But it's just part of who I am.
That's great. When did you decide that you wanted to actually understand how the forest worked?
Well, I think that, I always, when did I figure that out? I spent so much time in the dirt. Called it dirt back then, now I call it soil. And I had that curiosity from the very beginning about what made this place so beautiful. And I remember when I was a kid, I guess I was probably in middle school, and there was this outside of my house, the city where I lived, they had this pipe that was spewing out all this water that was foamy and awful looking. And so this was in the 1960s, and although I hadn't read Rachel Carson's book Salt Spring yet, those were those times. That's when pesticides were being used more and more in the U.S. and we were starting to use them more in Canada. And so at that point, I actually in the 1960s, I wrote to the mayor of the town that I was living in, and I said, hey, this is awful. You guys should do something about this. And I got a letter back in a few months, and they said, oh, don't worry about it, kid. It's all good. But I knew in my heart that it wasn't all good. And so I think that was my first little foray into environmentalism. And then eventually going back to school when I was a university student and finding out that there was this field called forestry. And there was this faculty called forestry. And here I had no idea what that meant. That people actually made a profession out of this. And so I had a friend, and he says, why don't I was trying to figure out what to do. Should I become a writer? Should I become whatever should I become? And he said, go to forestry. And I'm like, what's forestry? And so I went and I realized, well, this is what my family does. I guess I do kind of belong here. So anyway, it kind of happened that way. And I've never looked back. It's been incredible. Like I've learned so much. And I think that where I came from was so foundational to what I've done and what I've researched, what I've discovered. Those years of living as a kid in the bush really are, now I look back and I think that was so crucial for my understanding of how the forest worked.
Can you talk us through, the big discoveries that you've made in your work?
It's been so much fun, but yes, there's been lots, and it's been a real adventure, but it started out, just, again, following on that example of as a kid, seeing things that I thought were wrong, and becoming a forester, and then I got a job in the forest industry, and that was really crucial for me to work there, to see what was going on, because it was so different than what I'd grown up around. It was industrial logging, which we all know now today what that looks like, because it's across our landscape, you can't miss it. But it was that kind of the beginning when I was a student in 1980 doing that, and I thought, there's something not right here. It was a disconnected landscape. And I think that realizing it was disconnected made me eventually go on to figure out, what are we disconnecting? And so it was like one discovery led up to the next, to the next, to the next. But it really started out from that desire to try to figure out what we were doing wrong. Even though at the time people didn't think that there was anything wrong. I think they felt like we had this vast landscape of forest. I'm sure there were people that, like me too, that were a bit suspicious, but it was really, again, moving on with that Rachel Carson theme of the pesticides, and we were starting to spray herbicides in British Columbia in the 1980s to try to get rid of these native plants that were considered evil in our ecosystems, which was, to me, just part of that disconnection story. And so that was my first thing, was to try to figure out why were we doing that, and what was it doing to our ecosystems? And so this could go on and on. I could talk and talk and talk. I haven't even got to the first thing yet.
That's great. Keep going.
Okay, so in 1985, I think most of you were around here then. Just judging. 1985 is when British Columbia had been on this long route of increasing our cut in our forests. And the allowable annual cut, which is the amount of cut that we're allowed to do every year, which, by the way, in the last 30 years has been about the same. It's never really changed, just little dips here and there, about 70 million cubic meters per year. In 1985, we were building up to that, and there was, up until that point, there was really no requirement to reforest the landscape after logging. I mean, companies were starting to do it, but there was this incredible, what they called backlog back then, of unforested or not forested enough clear cuts. And so they decided that the reason why we were losing, or we were reforesting, is because all these weeds were coming in. Well, they were the native plants, the huckleberries, the thimbleberries, the devil's club, the native plants. They were part of succession. And so there was this war that started on native plants. And that was right around the time that the war in the woods was also starting. So 1982 is when the Nechonlith Nation actually started protesting the clear cutting of Mears Island. And that was also the time that they were starting to spray herbicides across the province to get rid of the native plants. And I just started on thinking, what the heck are we doing? And I started a study looking at, what if they were really after alder, by the way. It was like the big evil one, and spraying it. And I finally went in and did this study, which I've been following now for, I guess, for 30 or 40 years. Really, yeah, 30 years, 35 years. And I found out that when we got rid of alder, that the ecosystem started to unravel. First of all, they were not even just after alder, they were after all the plants, right? The more we get rid of, the better. And so I figured out that, when we got rid of alder, we also got rid of the nitrogen. We also got rid of these understory plants. And so then, and as a consequence, and this is coming, I'm not even getting to any of the good stuff, but one of the things I remember the most is the water table rose up, right? So when the trees were taken off and the native plants were taken off with the herbicides, that the water table rose up. And when I was sampling the soils, I remember thinking, because I was looking at nitrogen, thinking there's no soil structure left here because there were no roots. And so it was just these pine trees and this soil that had collapsed. And then eventually I figured out that actually these ecosystems needed alder to maintain the nitrogen availability in the stems. That took about 10 years. And then about 10 years after that, I went back and I found out that the mountain pine beetle had come through. So the mountain pine beetle started in the early 1990s, swept through the province, swept through my experiment in about 2003, and I figured out that where we had taken away the alders, that all the pines were attacked by the mountain pine beetle, and where the alders were left, they were still all fine. Right there in the same site, which was incredible. And we were able to reconstruct through dendrochronology that we had actually, through the weeding out of these native plants, had stressed the trees so much that their nitrogen levels had gone down, they were under physiological stress, they had grown a little bigger, but the beetles went after them and killed them first. And so what I discovered in that process is that our management practices were in the pursuit of trying to get rid of weeds to grow big trees, that we were actually killing these ecosystems. Now today, when we look at our landscape and just bringing it home to right now, at this moment that we're in right now, that collapse of the soil that I was measuring is exactly what is happening in those ecosystems around Merritt and Princeton, where the floods are happening right now. That when you log those forests and the trees are gone and the transpiration is gone out of that site, the water table rises up, and if you've gotten rid of the forest floor, which, by the way, we do that really well, which is the main protective element of those ecosystems, then they just slide. And so even in those cases where there was very little rainfall, those ecosystems, the soils have collapsed and they just slide down the slope and into the rivers. So I think that has been a major informative discovery for me. And then all the rest kind of fell off, came after that, about what else are we disconnecting in these ecosystems. So So I think I'll stop at that.
That's great. So this policy of free to grow, which is essentially what you're describing, of getting rid of everything that grows around the prime product, the fir or the cedar. Are we still doing that?
Yeah, we are. We're still doing that. Those policies, so I started fighting that policy in 1985, as soon as it was enacted. And today, this is still the policy. It still drives the spraying of herbicides in the northern part of our province. There's been enough protests in the south because there's more people that you don't see it so much. But it still is very, very much, that's the rule that these trees have to be free of other plants in order to be considered to be a healthy ecosystem for the next products. But you know what it's created in this province is very simplified forests. If you, anywhere, even along the coast here, I've spent a lot of time on the coast here this summer, and those forests are very, very simple. You know, it's pretty much just Douglas fir or spruce or lodgepole pine, and the native plants are not there. So it was very successful in that pursuit. But there are consequences to that.
Yeah, let's talk about those consequences. You know, we're coming into a time of rapid climate change. We're seeing it play out this past week in spades. How do you think our forests are going to do under this regime of free to grow?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, we've really set them up to be very vulnerable. So, Tara, you know this probably more than anybody, is that biodiversity matters. And biodiversity matters across all scales, whether you're in the soil, in a soil crumb, to a landscape. Many, many studies have shown that productivity of forests and resilience of forests increases as biodiversity goes up. And this has been studied worldwide in all kinds of scales. So that biodiversity, is missing. It's not completely missing, but it's really, really reduced. And even like our own government, the Forest Practices Code, has quantified this loss of biodiversity, even in the plant communities, never mind the birds and the animals. And so, yeah, when you reduce biodiversity, you reduce productivity and you reduce resilience, meaning that, if some event happens, like an atmospheric river, when floods happen, or the mountain pine beetle, or fire, and you have, if you have multiple species, it's likely that at least some of them are going to survive those events because they're more resistant or more resilient. And so then they will fill in the gaps that are created by the loss of the species that were susceptible. And so in that very simple example, you can see that as long, even with an extreme event, something is going to survive, and they fill in the gaps, and they photosynthesize, and they drive the carbon cycle, which drives, the soil nutrient cycles, the carbon cycle, and so then these systems can recover. But when you simplify them down, their ability to recover goes down a lot.
One thing that really struck me about the work that you do is thinking about these times of great stress and just how these plant species are helping each other below ground. And so can you talk to us just about how are they're sharing water, they're sharing carbon, they're sharing nitrogen? How is this happening?
Yeah, so I'll carry on the storytelling part of this. So after I did that alder study and found out we were unraveling ecosystems, I was working in other systems where we were trying to get rid of birch and aspen and cottonwood. It was like a war on these poor trees, which, by the way, fix more carbon than our conifers per year and shovel it below ground and store it below ground. And I was wondering, why are we doing this? And finding that, diseases were spreading through the plantations, these simplified plantations. And so I thought, these pathogens are taking over the firs, and when we take out the birch, that it increases the infection rates. And so I started looking at, well, what connections are we missing? And so that was what led me to start looking at other fungi in the forest. And so one group of those fungi are called mycorrhizal fungi. And the simplest way is to think of them as helper fungi. Instead of pathogens like these pathogens I was seeing spreading through the forest, these fungi associated with the roots of the trees. And they basically absorb the photosynthate of the trees to grow their own bodies through the soil, which is the mycelium. And the mycelium coats all of the soil particles, the soil pores, and they gather nutrients and bring them back to the tree, and they trade them for that photosynthate. And I discovered that these fungi actually connect these trees below ground. And I was building on the work of a few others before me, but I was really interested in it because I could see this unraveling of our ecosystems. And so then I just started experimenting with these linkages. And first, the first thing I looked at as a forester, you think, okay, I was very trained, right? I was a very trained forester. Foresters want to get their trees light and water and nutrients. And so that's the first thing I went to, because that's what I thought too. I was thinking that way too. Well, what's happening here? So I looked at light, which is translated into photosynthate when its light is fixed into photosynthate, and that drives the carbon cycle. And I found that carbon was moving back and forth through these networks, from birch trees to Douglas fir trees, and then back again, and back and forth, and back and forth. And when the birches were shading the firs, and I know you guys have all heard this story before, that's why you're here. But when the birches shaded the firs, they sent more carbon to the firs. And this was mind-blowing, because this was the antithesis of what we'd been doing all this time, all these years, of trying to get rid of these plants that were actually sharing their energy with their conifer neighbors. So that was the first thing I looked at. Then the next thing I looked at was the other thing foresters think about, which is nutrients. And so I looked at nitrogen, and it turns out that birch were also sending nitrogen to the firs. And then I looked at water, the third thing that foresters think of, and they were sending water. All of these resources they were sharing with their neighbors. Yeah, so that was one thing, and it eventually led me to look at other messages that were transmitting below ground, but I'm going to let you ask me the next question before
I want to go back to, so we still have these quite draconian policies in place around, free to grow. And we have a really interesting culture. There's a culture in forestry, and it's a culture that you have managed to wade your way through, but not without a lot of challenges. Maybe can we talk about that culture?
Yeah. What a culture. When you're struggling in a moment, you don't realize you're in a struggle, or you do, but you just keep fighting. You just keep trying to survive, and that's all I've ever done is try to survive in this culture that I was on the edge of. I was on the fringes of it. I was like, girls had just started coming into forestry, and so I met head on into this field that I didn't belong in. And, but I had to survive, right? I was a survivor. I watched my grandfather survive and invent and transform and move his way through systems. My mother was the same. And so that's what I did, is I ducked, I avoided, I went around, went over, I did everything I could to survive. And when I hit a wall, which I always did, I usually, always, I think it'll keep happening forever. The first wall I hit was I really wanted I wanted to be a silviculturalist, right? I just wanted to be like my grandpa. I just wanted to be out there doing this stuff. And I worked to, as the only girl in the company, to figure out how do we do ecosystem-based management. Really, that's what I was doing, ecosystem-based management. And I knew these ecosystems, I spent all my time in them. And so I was gunning for this job that I knew was going to come up. And it came up, and they gave it to my one of my male buddies. And I was just like, oh, shoot. And I think that was one of the first big, that was a big blow for me, because I worked so hard to be unique, to have a unique, special skill that my male colleagues, and I was only in my early 20s, by the way, I wasn't that old. But that was really instructive to me. And so instead of giving up, I just sidestepped it. And I went, okay, I'm going to get a job somewhere else. And I kind of kept doing that. I even did that, later on I was in government. I eventually made it into government. And I was a researcher, and of course I was always kind of on the outside, but I worked my butt off, and I did tons of research, and but I was never in the inner circle, right? I was never in those forward think tanks. I was never, in the big projects. I was always kind of carving my way out on the outside. And then when government kind of collapsed in 2002. The NDP lost, Liberals got in power, the Forest Practices Code was thrown in the trash can, and a lot of us that worked on the Forest Practices Code also were thrown in the trash can. We were told, if you have somewhere else to go, then go. And so I did. I left and I went to academia. And so what's happened in academia? Well, that's a good conversation to have.
Let's talk about that. I mean, there's a culture within forestry, within the Faculty of Forestry at UBC, where Suzanne and I are both faculty members. I mean, there is definitely a culture there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there any microphones in there or cameras?
What I think is really interesting is for both of us that work in the space of trying to understand ecosystems and think about restoring biodiverse, functioning ecosystems that serve humans but also serve plants and animals. There's not a lot of us in the Faculty of Forestry that think that way. I mean, it's growing. But there's also, when you think about the free-to-grow policies and these other policies, I'm sure many of them came from folks that came out of our faculty.
Definitely. The Faculty of Forestry at UBC is a foundational, principle-laying institution that has provided the principles, the theories for the practice of forestry today. The free-to-grow policy came straight out of the Faculty of Forestry that was influenced by the US policies. But when I was a forestry student back in the early 80s, there were about 10 girls in the faculty as students. The other 90 were young men who came from forestry families, and they were very proud of it. They with their red straps and their big boots and the sexist comments, my God. We didn't know it at the time, but as girls, we were just there trying to survive. But that was what it was, right? And that's where the Faculty of Forestry got its name, it's got its foundation, and grew from that. And I, as a student, as we were saying over dinner, I didn't have a single female professor through my entire undergrad or graduate degree. And so it really was a male-dominated field, and it was really an industry field. And I remember, my male student colleagues being so proud that they were working for Macmillan Bloedel or Canfor or WFP, and they were going into the valleys up Knight Inlet and Rivers Inlet and Kingcome Inlet, and their jobs were to basically clear cut, lay out the clear cuts and clear cut. And they would come back to, in the fall and just be so proud and now I go into those inlets and now I know what the heck they were doing, right? There's nothing left. Everything has been clear cut. So that came from the Faculty of Forestry. Now, so just moving through time, it started to change. I left and went down to Oregon State and did my degrees and my graduate degrees. But in that period of time is when Clydewood Sound happened, the Great Bear Rainforest was developed, the faculty started to change. The first female professor came in about 1990. Then a few trickled in after that. By the time I got there in 2002, there were probably 5 or 6. Now our department is at least half female. So that has changed. That's a huge, huge change. but it's still got the ghost of forestry past still lurks in the hallways. And I think it's really kind of telling that, that here we are, like you and I, Tara, are out there, trying to defend the last bits of old growth, and there's not that many of us doing that. And I think that there is a level of fear, there's a level of history, there's a culture there that's hard to break. Even if individual people want to break out of it, it's really hard as an institution to make those big transformative changes.
Yeah, I think it's been very illuminating, because if there was an organization that should be taking a stand right now for the old growth, it should be the Faculty of Forestry. And so that's something, it's quite interesting that this culture still persists, even though we have, we're gaining some really wonderful faculty. I'm getting the look from Michael. It's time to turn it to the floor.
Someone has to ask about the mother tree. Someone has to ask about Fairy Creek, and there are probably 100 other questions. So put up your hands, and Minor Lee.
I don't know how to use this when I got a mask on.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Are you okay?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm just thinking about you and Alexandra Morton, like what a journey, fight she had to get people to recognize what she was studying and finding.
Mm-hmm.
And like, I think you started saying 1985 was sort of when you were doing this. Well, I have two things. I sort of like to know, what tools do you use in your research? And then also, did you have anybody that was like saying, wow, this is pretty amazing, and sort of collaborating with you? Did you have help, like through cohorts at all? And now are people saying, oh, interesting, Suzanne? Huh.
So the tools that I use have evolved, changed over time as technology and research has changed. And I'm not an inventor of tools. I'm not even at the forefront of using tools. I'm a user of tools. So to answer, my love is the ecosystem, and what I can apply these tools to make me help me understand the ecosystem, then I use them. So what do I use? I use a lot of isotopes. And so isotopes are just like, we have a lot of natural isotopes of different elements in our environment. So carbon has got 3 or 4 isotopes. There's carbon-12, which is so prevalent. That's what we have. 99% of our carbon is carbon-12, but we also have a radioactive carbon-11. We have a stable isotope, carbon-13. We have another radioactive isotope called carbon-14. And so I use all these isotopes as tracers to see where things move from plant to plant. And I was always interested in how plants were moving compounds around. Even when I didn't even know that I was interested in it, I was interested in it. And so I remember going to my master's supervisor and says, well, what about, do you think that this would work? And he's going, you should just do a PhD on that. So I did, eventually. But so I used isotopes a lot because I thought they were fantastic tools. And then over time, at first, looking at mycorrhizas, it was like with the bare eye, and then it was with a microscope, and then molecular tools came on board. And molecular tools, which are looking at DNA sequences, were a fantastic revolution, and we could figure out what species there were without having to look under the microscope or just at mushrooms in the field, which are fascinating, by the way. But then eventually those molecular tools have also developed so that you can not just figure out the species, you can figure out what gene sequences are doing and what the regulation of those gene sequences mean, and how does that translate into defense chemistry of seedlings and fungi. And so I've just sort of watched the development of the tools and have been an adopter of that, but I've never been on the forefront of developing any of those tools. And then of course, just the other big tool I use is the forest, right? I spend almost all my research is in the forest, which I think Tara and I depart from a lot of our colleagues in that way, in that we are in the forest doing our work, whereas a lot of our colleagues are in the lab or in front of their computer screens. And so I kind of call them armchair forestry ecologists. But being in the field is really the greatest laboratory of all. So those are my basic tools. Oh, and a truck. I have to have a truck. And a whole bunch of students. Those are the other, and they're not tools, they're great friends. What was the other part of your, oh yes. So what did they say? So I published that, I did that research. I did following these isotopes, moving between trees, which was phenomenal. And then I would come back from Oregon State because I was working in government at the time, and I was like, I'm finding all this stuff, and it's like, and then I came back one time and I said, climate is changing. And they're like, oh, come on, climate's not changing. What kind of an idiot are you? So anyway, eventually I got on and I actually published my PhD work, and I sent it to Nature, and it got published in Nature. And I didn't really know that Nature was such a big deal, but and neither did the Ministry of Forests. But yeah, I got it. My colleagues were at academia were so excited that this had gotten into Nature, and I'm going, okay, I guess this is exciting. But the whole Ministry of Forests just took a big snore. They didn't do anything. And then I started getting some media calls, because that apparently Nature is a big deal. And so I was getting phone calls from like the Globe and Mail and from the London Times, and in my little desk in the Forest Service, for Pete's sakes, and getting interviewed on the radio, and my colleagues are like, "Shut up, Suzanne! Like, just shut up! Don't say that stuff." And I think that the moment that was the most difficult for me, I think in my whole, now I look back and I've had a number of difficult moments, but one of the difficult moments was at that very time when the Nature paper came out, and I was getting interviewed by Justine Hunter from the Globe and Mail, and I had my two little babies, and one of them is here right now. Where is she? Nava. She's 21, she's up there now. And I was, with the little babies, and I get the phone call from Justine Hunter, and she's going, and what about those, spraying the herbicides? And I said, well, for all the good they're doing, they might as well paint rocks. Well, that was not a good thing to say. I dropped the baby, but I got a letter put on my file. I was pulled in front of, the senior management team, and I was told that my work was a dog's breakfast. I was from that point on, everything that I wrote or published was scrutinized. Even after it had been through the journals, they would go back and they would get my colleagues to review my work again afterwards. And so basically, at that point when I said you might as well paint rocks, I might as well have painted my own grave, to be honest. But I didn't know it at the time, and I persevered and I kept trying and trying, but I really wasn't getting anywhere. So yeah, the comment from the ministry was, please just go away, please.
Thank you very much, and thoroughly enjoyed your book, by the way. I thought it was just a perfect mixture of science and sort of bearing it all. It's without getting melodramatic. It was a great balance.
Thank you.
My question is about you talked about the simple symbiosis of exchange of the carbon for minerals and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, it gets more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in how does the other end work out? For instance, the mother tree helping the weaker trees or other species, exchanges of carbon between species.
Mm-hmm.
Are the fungi honest brokers? Are they actually, what's in it for them? Because basically they could just keep soaking up. the photosynthate and not necessarily give it away. You know, even though the tree might want to give it away to help its weaker children. So how does that work out? How did that evolve?
Yeah, you know, I think we kind of our minds get in this trap of natural selection to think that that we're defying the rules of natural selection, which is really about fitness, right? It's about fitness so that you can reproduce. And then the speciation that follows from that fight to be fit. So development of species through competitive exclusion. And sometimes when we're in that pursuit of thinking in that way, which is not wrong, by the way, I think it all fits with that, but we forget that these ecosystems are complex systems that you get fitness from being in your community. It's not your fitness as an individual fighting it out on your own. You're fit because you have a community around you. It's true for all of us. It's true for all the fungi too, and the trees and the mice and the voles. So in that exchange that you're talking about, the fungi are seeking fitness and to survive and reproduce. And their main limitation is energy, right? I mean, most of us it is, but they can't photosynthesize. They're living below ground. And so they go into this partnership with the trees. And so, or other plants. So they're getting carbon. They're dependent on those trees for photosynthase. Some of them can actually pick up carbon from organic matter too. Those are a special group, and that's a special task. But it's to their advantage to have multiple sources of carbon. It's like, you know, it's like you gotta have lots of friends in case one of them goes on a trip. You gotta have another friend over that does something else. So it's in their self-interest to actually be associated with many different plants, so they can have carbon coming from other plants. And so in so doing, an individual fungus will then, you know, gladly associate and link together different trees and plants because that's multiple sources of carbon. And the trees, of course, like what's in it for them to be moving carbon around like this? And it's not always from weaker to poorer. It actually it's a back and forth thing. Not from stronger to weaker. It's a back and forth thing. And so what's in it for them to be trading carbon? Well, in the case of multiple species of trees associating with each other through multiple fungi, and they're linked in this network, this tapestry really, they're getting fitness from having a diversity of neighbors, which goes back to our earlier conversation. In the case of the birch and fir, for example, just to bring it home to an example, the fir was very susceptible to root disease, but when it was in the neighborhood of birch, the birch had fixed a lot of carbon. It has this beautiful rhizosphere community of bacteria and nematodes and all kinds of soil creatures that feed on each other, but some of those bacteria are actually have antibiosis associated with them, and that they have antibiotic properties that actually reduce the fungal pathogenicity on the fir. And so the fir, it's in its favor to be associating with birch because it gets less infections. And the birch, at the same time, is actually benefiting from associating with fir because birch has got other bacteria associated with it which fix nitrogen. And then the nitrogen content of the soil goes up, which causes acidification of the soil. And so it actually needs birch neighbors, it needs fir neighbors to reduce, that nitrogen, the nitrogen content of the soil to make it a more equitable amount of nitrogen. Otherwise, the soil becomes too acidic. And so then they're both benefiting from associating with each other without even having to invoke that one is giving carbon to the other at the expense of one, right? We don't even have to do the math. We can just look at the whole community and say, of course it makes sense that the whole community benefits from that diversity. But of course, as people who do reductionist science, we always do want to kind of do a market analysis of this, is who's benefiting from what. And when we do that, we always get tripped up because we can never count it all up, right? We can never actually add up all the magic that's in there. We always come up short. And so then, then I'll go, oh, that doesn't make sense. But if you stand back and look at that ecosystem, we know that diversity really matters. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
I'm looking for female questioners, but in the absence of any,
Thank you. I know one of your forays up to Fairy Creek was with the Seattle reporter and something to do with the speckled belly lichen.
Yes.
Yeah, I was there that day, but I didn't know. Someone said, "Oh, there's a scientist up there with a reporter from Seattle," and I said, but you can go down and have a look at where they're starting to cut down here. So I went and did that, and then I found out later that it was you that went down the hill when we were walking out in the dark. Anyway, can you tell us the role of the speckled belly lichen in that ecology?
Yeah. So it turns out that, the first time I went to Fairy, so this is the second time, I've been 3 times. So the first time I went, I actually went with the woman who discovered the speckled belly lichen. She was one of the people that went in there with us, Natasha. I can't remember her last name. Natasha. She had found it in there. And so as soon as we walked in the forest, there it was. And so the speckled belly lichen, it actually looks like paint, dried paint, but it grows on the bark of, and the branches, especially of Amabilis fir. And so it was all over the place in there. There were other lichens too. So as soon as we walked in there, there was lobaria on the ground as well. Lobaria it has bacteria, cyanobacteria that live inside of it that are nitrogen fixing bacteria. And so they were in there. They were I figured they're like the main source of nitrogen additions into that old growth forest. So that was one thing they did. I think the speckled belly lichen in particular, when it's so abundant in there, and apparently it's like the biggest local population of speckled belly lichen that exists or that anybody's seen on Vancouver Island. And in the moist season, of course, it's that the lichen is a foliose lichen. It's plump, full of water, and holds water. And of course, these are rainforests, so there's mist coming in constantly, and these lichens just absorb that mist, that water. And then in the summertime, when it's drying out, then they slowly dry out too, and they release that moisture. And in that process, they're actually keeping that atmosphere quite moist. They keep the forest moist. There are other roles that they would be playing as well in creating habitat for other bacteria that live on them, that do other jobs. But I think that this way of holding moisture in the forest is really, really important for the lichens. And of course, there were other lichens on the ground as well, many that I didn't know. So that is a forest that's full of lichens in the crown, and it's full of lichens on the ground. There were also Alectoria, which are old man's beard. There was Bryoria, which is another, foliose, one of those stringy beard lichens that's got actually lots of nitrogen in it, high protein content. That was in there as well. So I'm sure that that group, Jim Cuthbert and Natasha have done a full accounting of all the lichens in there, but it really struck me that the high lichen load was very important in that forest. And just to note, when I went back with Linda Mapes with the Seattle Times, and we didn't go into Fairy Creek this time, we went into the adjacent watershed, and by that time, Teal Jones had come in and were starting to harvest. And they had cut about 5 hectares, I think, into about 2 patches. And they completely missed the speckled belly. I mean, they didn't see it, right? So they carved out this 3-hectare patch, and all the trees along the outer edge of it had speckled belly lichens on them. And so all the trees that they had cut down, of course, would have had them on them as well. And so, it's astounding what is missed when you're not looking for it, but that forest is full of those lichens. Oh, and I'll say one other thing. In our work with the Mother Tree Project, which is actually in the interior of the province, we've been looking at the effect of clear cutting versus partial cutting versus retaining old forests on biodiversity. And what we find what we have found across the board, and we have about 25 forests that we're studying, so it's very extensive. This experiment is really, it's a 900 kilometer long climate gradient with 25 forests that we're following and trying these different harvesting methods, and we found that the species that suffer the most are the lichens and the mosses. So you lose all the lichens from the crowns when you clear cut, and you lose almost all of the lichens from the forest floor. So, and it would be the same thing at Fairy Creek.
So I thought I'd get political. So we've heard quite a bit recently from Horgan's government about what he plans to do to huge deferrals, the involvement of First Nations people in the decision making and so on. What's your sense of that process and whether you think this is actually going to protect the old growth in this province?
Good question. Where's Rachel? Rachel Holt is here. Anyway, Rachel was one of the authors of Last Stand Up for Biodiversity and did the mapping of remaining old growth in our province. And before I go into too much detail about that, I'm going to talk about it from what I know the most about, and that is that, what Rachel and group found is that, that of the Valley Bottom iconic old growth forests that, of course, British Columbia is famous for, and of course, those are the things those were the Valley Bottoms that were targeted first when colonization happened. They're nearby, they're hugely productive. That's what the logging companies went for first. So it actually makes sense that we have hardly any of that left. And what Rachel et al. Found out is that of those Valley Bottom big old growth forests with the high productivity, over a site index over 20, by the way, we have forests that have site index of 50, but they carved it down to what's reasonable to look at now. And there's only about 3% of these Valley Bottom pieces left. Those are extremely important forests because they're biodiverse and they store a lot of carbon. And of course, they're ecologically extremely important too. So we've got very little left. What does that mean from a carbon point of view? Well, I don't know if you guys have been watching the news lately, but we just had COP26. And lots of people are thinking about carbon right now. There were 2 really excellent articles that just came out. One was in Nature, the other one was from some local researchers in Canada. But basically they showed, number one, that Canada is one of the main forested countries of the world with high amounts of carbon in it. And that second group of researchers, so the coastal rainforests, the boreal forests of Canada are extremely important on the world stage for carbon, as are, of course, the tropical rainforests, but in the tropics, most of that carbon is above ground and then therefore quite vulnerable. The other major countries, of course, being Russia, Indonesia, the Congo, and the Amazon forests. And so Canada stands out as hugely carbon rich. The West Coast forests, where we are right now, in Canada stand out as the most carbon-rich ecosystems. So we are in a carbon hotspot right here on the west coast of British Columbia. Now, biodiversity and carbon are correlated with each other for good reason, because high biodiversity means higher carbon fixation, and I could go on about that, but they are correlated. So we're not only carbon hotspots, we're biodiverse hotspots. Canada contains 25% of the world's soil carbon. That was what that other part paper showed, 25%. So we have a huge, huge responsibility on the global stage to protect that carbon storehouse. So when it comes to old growth harvesting, we've got 3% of these hugely iconic valley bottom old growth forests left, which is where most of the carbon is stored, especially on the West Coast. They're highly biodiverse. We need to be protecting it as much as we possibly can, right? That is our responsibility as people of this world, is to protect these forests. Through the United States, the researchers down there have long identified the West Coast of North America as number one importance for saving for carbon and biodiversity. So what do I think of the deferrals? I think great. You know, we had to do it, it's time. I mean, it's way past time, actually. It's gonna be gone in 8 years anyway if we don't defer it now. And in the process of, if we were to log it all of that, most of that carbon ends up, 2/3 of it ends up in the atmosphere within a couple of years, because it's turned into paper products, toilet paper, shingles. That doesn't have a very long shelf life. And the other 1/3 ends up in longer term storage products like furniture or houses, but they don't last that long either, maybe a few decades. And so it's really our responsibility on the global stage to keep these carbon stores intact. So the old growth deferrals are a step in the right direction. As far as First Nations and Indigenous values, when you map out where the biodiversity is around the world, it maps directly onto where you have Indigenous stewardship of the land, right? Because they have a worldview that is, we're all together, we're all equal, we all have roles to play in these ecosystems, we're interdependent. And so, yes, so I think that then, according to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People and the Biodiversity Declaration and COP26, that all these things come together and tell us basically the same thing, that these things go together, we need to protect them together. That doesn't mean it's not without problems, right? Because we have a long history of colonization and colonialism, and our First Nations people, bless you, for all of you who are here, have had a huge struggle, as we all know. And there's poverty, there is needs, there's huge debt. And so the practice of that worldview is not straightforward. It is in terms of philosophy, but when it actually comes to practice on the ground and protecting communities and protecting the people of those villages and nations, it's not straightforward. So anyway, okay, I could go on and on about that. But
Yeah, so I have Rachel up here. And Suzanne just said that the deferrals were a great first step. How meaningful are they actually? How much of the really important old growth do they protect, and for how long do they protect them?
All right, so she's nice and I'm less nice. I'm Rachel Holt. I wrote the BC Last Stand report and looked at the state of old growth in BC a couple of years ago as input into the old growth strategic review piece. And I was just recently on the old growth technical advisory panel to the minister to look at the state of deferrals. And so from June till now, I've been working on that project, and I'm still technically working on that. And it's an interesting position to be in, to look at the machinations of what government is doing, because I've been working on old growth related things for the last 25 years. And so you asked about the genuine nature of what was happening there. I think it really, you can look at it through different lenses. You can look at it through the lens of, for the last 20 years, we've been ignoring the state of old forest. We've been ignoring the state of management of the forest. We've been ignoring all of that stuff. And so when they set up their panel, the Gawley-Merkel Old Growth Strategic Review panel that they did a couple of years ago to ask the question, they at least asked the question, should we manage the forest differently? What should we be doing around old growth? Asking the question is a huge first. It's really the first step. And so, they've gone along that path, and they hired us to do this work knowing that they probably didn't like the answer. And they didn't like the answer. Historically, there would have been about 25 million hectares of old forest in this province. We're now at, well, we were at 13 million hectares 2 years ago, but now that we've updated their data, because they don't manage data very well, we're down to 11 million hectares. Most of which is the little forest left. So, you know, we've run down to that point. They asked us what we thought should be deferred, and so we created these deferral maps, which covered about 2.6 million hectares. Those are the best of the remaining old forests. And so they said, in theory, we should defer those forests. But what they actually then did in their announcement was say, well, they didn't actually say we weren't going to defer those forests. They said, we could defer these forests, but let's ask the nations if they want to. And they said, the nations have to put their hand up if they want those forests to be deferred. So they had two really big choices at that point. They could have said, we think as the government, we set up this panel, we thought about what should happen, should we not harvest this forest? We as the government could say, we think we shouldn't harvest these forests in the short term. And if nations want to harvest them, they could stick up their hand, but they didn't. They said it the other way around, which was the crucial kind of failing moment in the implementation of deferrals. You know, so there is a history of coming up with, we think we should do the right thing, but we're actually not quite going to defer it. So in fact, even though there was such a furore in the last couple of weeks in the media, that not a single tree stands as a result of those deferrals to this moment. It is made zero difference about whether a tree is going to fall or not right now. So although there's still, you know, you can take it as the glass half empty or the glass half full version, we've gone a long way. We've changed how we're looking at the forest, potentially, but not a single tree stands as a result of the decisions that they've made, and they've put all the weight of that decision onto nations, which is somewhat unconscionable, I think. That's just my personal opinion. Anyway, so there's hope in that, in the sense that there is an opportunity for people to take this on, but in terms of government leadership, it hasn't actually moved us forward.
Thanks, Rachel. While we're waiting for the next question, one of the huge challenges faced by nations right now is that they, in order to save the forest, so I'm working with several nations. One of them has tried to purchase a forest tenure, and this in order to protect it, but the cost of that was enormous, and they have to get a loan to pay for that purchase. And so they have have incredible debt, and the only way to pay that debt is to log that forest. And so this is what's happening as nations are given this Hobson's choice of either you will log the forest, or you can log the forest. And so it's this is the injustice. This is the complete injustice that Rachel is referring to. Is that really, we as taxpayers should be buying those forestry licenses, not waiting for the nations to try and fund the protection of those forests.
Hello. I just wondered, in terms of sustainable ecosystem logging, is there something like that where you could log out a certain percentage without destroying the ecosystem it is part of?
Yeah.
And how much would that be?
Yeah, the short answer is yeah. In fact, people have been living and using forests since there have been people, which we evolved way after forests, by the way, and trees. So we've been using forests, cutting trees, harvesting them for art and wood, homes and transportation ever since we've been around. So there are sustainable ways to do it. And I think, what fits for what ecosystems depends on the ecosystem itself. And I think another thing to think about too is that disturbance is part of ecosystems. And humans are disturbers, as are fires and pathogens and wind. And, we're all, doing this, and forests have evolved to respond and rejuvenate following these disturbances. So it is a natural part, we're a natural part of the cycle of the forest. And I think that's an important thing to remember. We often think of ourselves as outside or superior or just utilizers of the forest. No, we're integral with it, and we've always been disturbing forests. So how much is too much, or how much is what's appropriate? Well, there is no single answer to that question. I think the important thing is not to go what we used to talk about natural disturbances. We shouldn't go beyond the range of natural disturbance. So that means, what did fire and wind throw and all that do without people being involved? And that whole concept arose still from thinking of ourselves as outside the ecosystem. And so people started studying back in the 1990s, what was that range of natural disturbance? That should guide us as to how much we could take out as people, to emulate fire, emulate pathogens. Well, that thinking was wrong too, because we've always been part of these ecosystems. And now when we start looking at, as people reconstruct what those natural histories look like on the landscape, and realizing that, well, for example, in the interior Douglas fir forest, that these meadows interspersed with uneven age fir forests and patches of grassland was really determined just as much by climate and all these natural features as indigenous burning for food and trade corridors and hunting and so on. And so we need to take that into account. Okay, so a long-winded answer is there is no correct answer to that, but what's reasonable? What is that ecosystem going to be able to be resilient to recover from? And not, pushing the ecosystem to the point of collapse and not doing the same thing everywhere are really good principles. What we're doing right now are both of those things. We do the same thing everywhere. We pushed our ecosystems to the point of collapse. And that is what we're seeing now when you have these extreme climate events that push the ecosystem over the edge, like the floods and the fires and so on. So we need to be pulling back and taking far, far less and over a much varied pattern. What I do in the Mother Tree Project is I'm working in interior Douglas fir forests and basically trying to answer the question that you just asked and realizing there is no single answer. But what I do know is that, so we have this experiment across this big climate gradient where we're testing different levels of retaining mother trees and finding out that it depends on what the climate is. But the more stress those forests are under, the more canopy cover they need in order to maintain the ecosystem processes and properties. When you have a more productive ecosystem, more trees can be taken out, and there will still be a very integral ecosystem with a lot of integrity. On top of that, though, again, it so much depends, and every ecologist says it depends, but the other thing that we found out from this study is that when you leave a more continuous canopy cover, even in the productive ecosystems, like on the coast, that you end up saving a lot more carbon than, the more trees you take out, the less carbon you have left over, and the more you disturb the understory. But you also need some disturbance in order to have regeneration to come in. So I'm getting tired from my own answer. Never once. I think that the more tree cover you can keep, the better. but also creating enough opening that you can get regeneration coming in, I think is a good answer, and not doing the same thing everywhere is also a good answer, and making sure that right now, at this point in history that we're at right now, where we're in a climate crisis, that leaving those old forests intact as much as possible is really important. Moving our harvesting that we do into second growth forests, because we've already lost so much from those forests, that we can, work with them to try to restore them, to open them up, to create more openings, more diversity. That's really important, but that's a whole different prescription than a harvesting of a primary forest. I'm going to stop now because I'm not going to land on an answer to this, I don't think.
Hey. I have two questions over here. I'm going to put them together, one after the other. So.
Okay.
Thanks. Suzanne, thanks for the work that you do. We're very lucky that you did it. And I'm kind of, it's funny because this is the right time for me to ask this question, actually, given your last answer. I want to turn it sort of around and talk about the issue of scale, so temporal and spatial scales. When I've seen, oh hurrah, they've set aside this area of old growth, but it's so small, and I think these are long-lived creatures that are very large, and that sounds like a large number, but it actually isn't, because the population is not being represented at this small scale of this reserve. So to turn this upside down, what I want to understand from you is, for the edges that they're exposed to, and so that you have solar penetration, you have wind penetration, you have evaporative losses, what is going on with the mycorrhiza and the fungus on those edges, and how do they fit into the human perspective of scale of forests?
That's a great question.
And it sounds like a tough question, so why don't you handle that in 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll go to the next question.
Okay. So there's time scales and spatial scales. So in a spatial scale, so the fungi, when you cut a forest, an old growth forest probably has about 100 species of fungi per hectare. And they all have different jobs. It's very diverse underground. These are mycorrhizal fungi, by the way, not the sabrotropes and the pathogens. That adds on a whole another layer of species. But about 100 per hectare is a good number to think about. That's average. If you clear cut it, you basically lose all of those fungi. Almost all of them are gone because they're dependent on older, bigger trees. And so they get simplified down to a few weedy dandelion fungi, maybe 5 or 6 per hectare. And they persist like that for quite a long time. It takes 50 to 100 years to recover the basic diversity of the fungi in a forest from growing back to a forest. As far as like going out from a patch of forest into the edge, it's however far those root systems go. And so we've actually done a lot of studies on this back in the 1990s. The root system of a tree actually goes quite far. It's about as far as it is tall. That's a good rule of thumb. So if your trees are 50 meters tall, then the roots go out about 50 meters, and that's probably about how far the fungi go. If you're getting into the middle, let's say you have a clear cut that's many hundreds of hectares, which is possible in our world, especially in the north, or even if it's 30 hectares, which is also more normal around here. The middle of those forests, once you are outside the tree length, you are at the very low diversity of fungi. And then that whatever diversity is there is dependent on the native plants and trees that might have been left behind when they've been cutting. On a temporal scale, okay, I'm going to 1 minute. On a temporal scale, it's much longer, right? So the fungi are extremely important over time because they are the linkage from generation to generation to generation, along with the seeds of the trees, of course. But they're also a link to the pace of change. So they have a life cycle that's really quite rapid. They can reproduce fairly quickly, many times over over even a year, or they reproduce in various ways by spores, through sclerotia, through hyphae. They're very flexible. And they're the sort of the flexible partner of the tree that can therefore adapt as things change, as climate changes, as seasons change, as the day changes. They are out there changing constantly, even while the trees are much, much slower. So on a temporal scale, then they're at the forefront of change. And of course they persist also. Not only do they change quickly and adapt quickly, but they persist for long, long periods of time in the soil, thousands of years. So they're incredible, really. Thanks.
So this is the final question. It's not really a question, it's sort of a statement. I ran a little experiment. For many years I walked along the shore of the Fraser River in Vancouver, called the Fraser River Park. And there you see the log booms coming up the river. I think I walked 15 years there pretty much every day. And here was my experiment. I asked people regularly, I'd say, look at that log boom, what do you think it's worth? And I asked men and women and children and everybody, every day. I hate to say it, but none of them had a clue. Women especially, not a clue. Sometimes they would say, oh, it must be worth a couple of $1,000s. It was, you know, oh, I don't know, 20, 25 booms, 3 or 4 tugs, you know, one pulling and the others all alongside, men working with their poles. These people didn't have a clue. How are you and your department and this government going to get the message to the world that how we use this lumber and how we waste it and how we tear down perfectly good houses in Vancouver that are full of old growth and throw them in the garbage, 40%, 60% of our landfill. How are we going to connect these dots? How are we going to get you guys out of the academia into the real world? And the people who are marching on the streets are those beautiful people at Fairy Creek who do know what you're talking about. How are we going to get the message out to all those people who I've been talking to? Healthy. I'm mad as hell about this.
I bet you are. I'm mad as hell too. You know, it's like people, I don't know, it's like they don't want to know, they don't want to step out, they don't want to, you know, put themselves at risk. But honestly, we're all at risk because people don't speak out. I think Tara and I are trying to do that. We're probably like, we're two of very few in our faculty who does. You know, when we go back, we're going to be talking to our friends and saying, hey, you know, it's awfully lonely out there being the only spokespeople to try and move the needle on this. But, you know, we'll, like, change can happen very slowly, but then it can happen very quickly. And that is how systems work, right? Systems work that they slowly chug along, and it seems like it's imperceptible, and then they hit a tipping point, and then it changes really quickly. And I feel like right now is a time, we're at this moment. It is a moment when all these things are converging together, and I think that, you know, where we all have to be out there, joining the Fairy Creek people, joining Greta Thunberg, joining the COP26 protests all around the world matter right now. It really matters. And then we'll pull along our colleagues if they want to come, and we'll be whispering in their ears, come along, it helps. And if they don't come, then go, okay, fine. But we are going to keep moving. And so, you know, sometimes it does only take a few, as long as the people are behind us. And so it's really, you know, you need good leaders, you need good mother trees, but you also need the rest of the forest pushing along. So everybody's got to be involved, and hopefully we'll bring our colleagues along as well.
And our students, we have amazing students, and they're very passionate about this, and that gives me huge hope. You know, many of our students have been up at Fairy Creek, and so I think that is enormous capacity for young folks right now to have voice, and also for all of you to have voice, and to use your privilege. I mean, I think the folks sitting in this room have a tremendous privilege, and we can use that privilege by, contacting our members of parliament, by writing letters, by supporting those that are on the ground.
We have one last burning question, so be patient.
This is a big question. It's not a question, it's a statement. I heard on CBC that you have sold the rights to your book to Hollywood, and that you're part of Amy Adams playing you, doing your life story in some kind of Hollywood setting. So that's a good story, because it's spreading the word very quickly, and hopefully it'll be well done.
I mean, that's the hope, right? So, it was kind of a funny thing. Like, I published this book, and it was I have an agent who has helped me, and it was his idea to take it to try to sell it to Hollywood, and took it to William Morris Entertainment, and they said, I don't know, like, it's kind of out there. But all of these production companies were super interested in it, and so so Amy Adams we selected her because she's an incredible actress. She's brings her full self to her characters. She comes from a huge family, so she is a character.
She's Canadian.
Is she Canadian?
Yes.
I didn't know she was Canadian. Okay. Yeah, no, it's not. Yeah, are you sure? But the hope is that, yes, British Columbia and the state of our forest will be the main character in that movie, and that this will make it. Yeah.
Well, we're going to call it a night with that. But I think we've got the answer to what we all need to do, which is to raise our voices and to support Suzanne and Tara in their important work. It's book buying time of year. All of you will be giving gifts to people. Just think of all those Finding the Mother tree books that can go underneath the trees on Christmas this year. Another great thing you can do to celebrate the holidays is to make a donation to the Salt Spring Conservancy in someone's name as a present to them. Make them feel good about the fact that you've saved a tree on their behalf. I mean, there's lots more you can do, but this is a very engaged island, and we've saved some trees here as well. So let's just keep doing it, keep putting our shoulder to the wheel, and to make the change that we all need. We're really lucky here at the Salt Spring Forum to have supportive businesses on Salt Spring Island. I need to thank a few of them. I need to thank Country Grocer, which is our series sponsor. I need to thank Salt Spring Books. They sold a lot of Suzanne's books, but they're most willing to sell you more. I need to thank ArtSpring, their staff, the volunteers. I need to thank Auntie Pesto's restaurant. We were out in the patio tonight. It was safe and the food was awesome. Harbour House Hotel, another really important sponsor of ours. And though we do not ask BC Ferries for discounts, they do carry our guests here very safely and effectively and then take them home. So thank you, BC Ferries. Just a couple of other things. We are building up towards having regular Salt Spring Forum events. We already have an amazing guest lined up for early next year. We'll probably hold a members-only salon at some point in the next 2 months. That's a really good reason to buy a membership for just $20 because you'll be invited to that. We hold these in some of the nicest living rooms on Salt Spring Island, so if you're interested in local architecture, this is also a great thing to do. And we try to call on the most amazing Salt Spring residents to be our moderators. We had a completely awesome moderator this evening. And Tara Martin is a story in her own in terms of the conservancy she does, not only here on Salt Spring, but for the entire Salish Sea. So thank you, Tara, for everything. Thanks to Richard Steele for doing all the hard work in organizing this evening. Thanks to George Shupos. And last but not least, a really big thank you to an environmental hero, Suzanne Simard.